Jehovah, our Heavenly Father, I come to you in prayer and ask that you please forgive us for our blood guilt, for your ever-changing blood doctrine, which has caused so many needless deaths, including that of my mother, Elizabeth Van Hassel. My mother died from the blood doctrine. Her name is Elizabeth Van Hassel. She was only 32 years old when she passed away.
CANDOR, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs all the way from San Antonio, Texas. We recently saw you on the Vice documentary Crusaders, Ex-Jehovah's Witnesses Speak Out, talking about your life in the Jehovah's Witnesses, focusing on how the JW's doctrine centering on blood transfusions impacted you and your family. Ash, the documentary was one of the most hard-hitting exposés I've seen on the JW, so how have things been since the premiere of the doc? How did people respond to your story?
Hey, well, first of all, thank you for having me on, and I apologize in advance if you hear any of my little rooster friends in the background. They will probably be popping in from time to time, so yes,
that's
apologize
cool.
In advance. But yes, so I guess the post-documentary period has been productive for me. I mean, I've continued to do activism as I had before filming the documentary as well. So it's been productive, and so far the response has been interesting, mostly positive. There are a few people who don't really care for my portion of the documentary. Some of them view it as, actually the worst I've heard was that I discredited the documentary and made it into a pseudo-documentary. And that's simply because of the style of activism that was portrayed in the documentary.
And Ash, people will want to know about the dark glasses. Is there a reason for that at the moment?
Yes, actually, I am on the autism spectrum, and I have what's known as photophobia, and it's basically sensitivity to light, and it's very painful. So usually I require glasses, especially in cases such as these where I'm needing to be lit directly in my face.
No problem, and they look very cool.
Thank you.
Just out of interest, do you know if any Jehovah's Witnesses watched the documentary, and do you know what they thought about it?
I have actually heard that some Jehovah's Witnesses did actually watch the documentary. I went on Reddit, and I looked around there and found out that there were some people that were showing the documentary to their Jehovah's Witness spouses and family members, and there was one in particular that I read of where the person said to their spouse, okay, we're going to watch the documentary, and here's the deal. The minute that they say something that isn't true, we'll shut it off. And the last that they posted was that it was 45 minutes into the documentary, and they hadn't shut it off yet.
Interesting.
I did come across a few instances of people who came to the XJW subreddit after seeing it on the documentary, and they came to tell everybody that they had seen it, that they were appalled, and that they were going to be leaving the organization as a result of what they learned from the documentary.
That is amazing. I mean, I suppose as the longer that the documentary is out there, the more this could happen. It's a bit of an exodus.
Yeah, it's wild, right?
Today we're going to be going into even more detail about your years growing up in the Jehovah's Witness religion than we saw in the Vice documentary, starting with those early days back in the 80s, being raised by both your mom and your grandmother. So tell us about those days. Your mom was quite young when she had you, isn't that right?
So my mother was actually born into the organization just like I was. She was a third-generation Jehovah's Witness. She was baptized at the age of 12, and by the time she was 14, only a couple years later, she was married to my father, who was 21 at the time, on the advice of the elders who were concerned about the possibility of her and my father having premarital relations. So my grandmother actually signed for them to get married. I mean, that's how that's legal. At age 15 is when my mother actually had me, which is quite young to be a mother. I mean, getting married at 14 is, that's intense as well. But yeah, she did not really take to it very well. I mean, that makes sense, of course. I mean, she was a child. She tried to go back home to my grandmother numerous times, and my grandmother would just take her back to my father's house and tell her, "You're a married woman now, this is what you're supposed to be doing, you're supposed to assume your role," basically. My mother did eventually move back home with my grandmother when she and my father divorced. It was, I believe, less than a year into the marriage that this occurred. After that point, I grew up primarily in my grandmother's house. My mother did eventually leave my grandmother's house, and I remained in my grandmother's house. So I ended up being raised pretty much just by my grandmother for most of my life. My mother did come back to collect me and take me to Florida with her when I was 12 years old. That's because she was married to a man in the Air Force, and he had put in for transfer to go to Florida to get away from my grandmother. So they took me forcibly. I didn't want to go. I really didn't want to go. I didn't want to be uprooted from my entire life. And yeah, part of the reason that he wanted to go to Florida to get away from my grandmother was because of the Jehovah's Witness stuff, and also because of some drug use and bad influence over my mother. So I was actually indoctrinated pretty much right out of the womb. I remember seeing videos of myself, as I mentioned in the documentary, quoting scriptures, walking around as a 1-year-old, 2-year-old baby, quoting scripture. Those were some of the first things that I learned to say. We were pretty regularly attending meetings and going out in field service. I have lots of memories of people slamming the door in my face as a child, which is actually really traumatizing. I didn't really understand why they were being so mean to me. I just thought that I was doing what I was supposed to and trying to help them, even. I didn't think I was doing anything that was particularly wrong. It's actually pretty messed up that they, drag children to the doors like that. I did question it pretty early on, though. I do recall being probably below the age of 10 and asking my grandmother, how do we know that we have the truth? How do we know that ours is the right religion? There are so many religions. There are so many sects of Christianity, even. How do we know that this is the correct one? And she would tell me, it's in the Bible. That was literally her answer. And she didn't expand on it either. So that was really frustrating for me. I mean, I'm a pretty logical person. Even as a child, I was very prone to wanting logical answers to things. And that did not sit well with me. That was very unsatisfying. I needed more. Unfortunately, I couldn't look for more answers because we were restricted to the literature that we had in the organization. We were not allowed to research outside of that as far as religion goes, because it was considered dangerous and it could contaminate our faith, or as the witnesses like to call it, stumble. It will stumble you and ultimately lead you down a path of apostasy, which is pretty much a death sentence as a witness.
Before we go into some more depth about your story, just for those who aren't too familiar with the Jehovah's Witnesses and their doctrine, can you give us an overview of the religion and what makes JWs different from other Christian sects?
Jehovah's Witnesses are mostly like other Christian religions. They're fairly strict about everything. They try not to consume any sort of, any worldly media or have any worldly friends, really, so you're pretty isolated. They believe in Armageddon, and they also believe that it's right around the corner. They've believed that for decades and decades. They also believe in shunning, which there are some other religions that believe in that, but they're quite they're quite adamant about that practice. They encourage it very strongly. They teach that it's out of love that you shun, to try to make an errant family member return. It doesn't really work, though. It actually causes people to commit suicide. They also teach that you should not have a blood transfusion, and they base that off of a scripture in Acts that tells you not to eat blood, which is a little strange that they interpret it that way, but they like to use that, I believe, anyway, in my opinion, they like to use that to differentiate themselves from other sects of Christianity. They believe blood is sacred and it's a symbol of life, but in their case, the symbol becomes more important than the life itself. And of course, as most people know, Jehovah's Witnesses preach door to door, usually on the weekends, but you'll find pioneers out during the week as well. Back in the day, they actually used to tell you that you could approach people at like gas stations or in parking lots and stuff. They tell you not to do that anymore. I'm not really sure why, because I haven't been around for a while, but I do know that they tell you not to approach people anymore. That's why a lot of them end up doing the witnessing carts that you see sometimes in places of high traffic, like malls, airports.
Standing with the magazines, yeah.
Right. They even put it in front of colleges, or even in front of amusement parks. I've seen that at Disney World. That's really weird.
When you hit your teenage years, you experienced a lot of stress and even some self-loathing as you began to recognize yourself as part of the LGBT community. So talk about that.
To some degree, even as a small child, I always knew that there was something different about me. I didn't feel like I belonged in the role that was set out for me. I didn't feel like I should be wearing dresses, playing with oh my goodness, I hated Barbie dolls. But my family bought me like loads and loads of Barbie dolls, expecting me to enjoy that. They were trying to force them on me, really. I would just keep them in the boxes and put them on the shelves. I didn't even want to play with those. I was the only girl in kindergarten, I remember, with a Ninja Turtles backpack. I loved the Ninja Turtles. I didn't feel like playing with the girls most of the time. I didn't really have friends that were girls. I played with the boys. I always wanted to play the video games, play the sports, just do stuff that felt more like me. So from the time I was a small child, I felt like that. And then as I grew into my teenage years, it got even stronger. Puberty really, really cements those sorts of feelings, especially for trans people, because you start to develop in ways that you don't want to. And that's what happened to me. I started to develop physically, the secondary sex characteristics of someone who didn't feel like me. And it made me very depressed. And I couldn't really tell anybody about that. I do remember trying to bind my chest once with duct tape. And that, it was probably not a good idea. but I felt actually kind of normal for just a moment.
Yeah.
And I remember being especially afraid to share this because the Jehovah's Witnesses are not at all accepting of LGBT people. In fact, I remember my grandmother talking about them as though they're some kind of disease. She would tell me all the time when she would see like a gay couple out holding hands, that's disgusting. Look at those disgusting people. The one time I went to work with her, she cleans houses, or did. She had a client who had transitioned to being female. And I remember peeking my head into the room and asking, what's wrong with the person in there? Because they were lying in there after they had had surgery, gender reassignment surgery. My grandmother told me, "Don't look at them. They're disgusting. He mutilated his body." And that really freaked me out because I had the feelings of, wanting to change my physiology. And I knew that there was no way I was going to be able to do that was ever going to be okay with my family or that would ever be okay with God. At least that's how I thought at the time.
When you were 17, your mother had a car accident and ended up in hospital. This was stressful enough for you and your family, but it became a lot worse. Take us through that story.
So my mother had a car accident, and she was living in Florida at the time. We were still in Texas, me and my grandmother. And it was a pretty bad accident. She did end up in the hospital, and we knew about it because the hospital ended up calling my grandmother and asking her to give consent for a blood transfusion. My mother had originally given consent, but then when she got brain swelling and had been off of her psych meds, she began to go into psychosis and just have general issues with her mental faculties. So the doctors did not think that she was in a position to deny a blood transfusion. They thought that it was because of those issues that she was denying it. So yes, my grandmother was contacted, and I happened to be sitting right next to her while she was having this phone call. And my grandmother told them that she is not to be given any blood, even if she has to die. At that point, we did end up driving all the way to Florida from Texas, and we were at her bedside, and it was pretty grim. My mother was yellow with jaundice. She did not look well, abdomen distended, barely able to even talk. I do remember that she looked at us and said, "You're only here because I'm dying, aren't you?" That was really sad. I'll always remember that. But yes, they were still trying to talk to my grandmother about giving my mother a blood transfusion. My mother was going to, probably going to need it because she was not doing well. She really would have needed it to get her health back up. We thought she was doing better, so we did end up driving back to Texas. But right as we were approaching the border of Texas, the hospital called us and said she had taken a turn for the worse. They said she was going to die unless they did an exploratory surgery to figure out what was wrong exactly, and they really did need to give her blood. So we turned right back around, drove all the way back to Florida, and my mother was on a ventilator at that point. She was not able to breathe on her own and was sedated. At that point, Jehovah's Witnesses got involved.
Your mom desperately needed a blood transfusion in order to survive, and this is when the Jehovah's Witnesses Hospital Liaison Committee appeared on the scene. Ash, what exactly is a hospital liaison committee, and how did this affect you and your family?
A hospital liaison committee is a group of elders that are assigned the task of visiting people in the hospital and advising them on the policies surrounding the blood doctrine. That's officially what they say they're for. But really, the truth is, they're meant to pressure you into not taking a blood transfusion, essentially. And, they don't necessarily bully you, like, in a mean sort of way. They peer pressure you. They guilt trip you. They try to tell you, they'll bring up the scripture. They will be around. They'll just be present. Their very presence is usually enough to pressure people into making some very devastating choices for their family members.
And will they come to the hospital over and over again? Like day after day, if need be?
Yes, they'll usually return to the hospital every single day and visit with the family members to continue to put the pressure on them. I know that when we were at the hospital, we were pretty much staying there every night, not actually leaving my mother. We would just sleep in the waiting room. And every single day, the hospital liaison committee would come back, and they would be there under the guise of being moral support. Oh, well, we're coming to pray with you. We're coming to support you in this because you need spiritual support. But what they were really there to do was strong-arm my grandmother into making the choice to kill her daughter.
Yeah. And it seems strange to me that they would send this committee. I mean, if it was your choice, you would think that they would just, have to live with it. But it seems almost as if they feel it's going to affect the organization some way.
Right. They say that it is a conscience matter and that they will not disfellowship you over it, but that's not true. I've actually known people who have gotten disfellowshipped from their congregation after the elders find out that they've had a blood transfusion, or they don't get disfellowshipped, but they still do get shunned by family members. My uncle actually suffered from that. He's still alive, by the way. It's important to them that people are obedient to this rule. It gives them credibility as a religion. It continues to uphold that different standard that they have that sets them apart from other sects of Christianity. And it creates martyrs for the religion. It actually sort of keeps the other witnesses in line. It sort of pressures them to remain faithful to the organization. Oh, look, this parent actually sacrificed their child. They did the right thing. Their child is going to be with them in paradise. They really must have faith, so this really must be the truth. So, in the end, I remember that final day, there were several different doctors over the course of several hours meeting with my grandmother one at a time, trying very hard to explain to her that if my mother did not receive a blood transfusion, she would almost certainly die. It's detailed pretty well in the medical records that I have of hers. It's really sad. But my grandmother did ultimately sign for my mother to have a surgery without a blood transfusion, which ultimately led to her death. She didn't even make it to the OR. She died as they were pumping air into her manually on the way to the OR. Her lungs collapsed. I actually feel that it's not my grandmother who is truly responsible for my mother's death. The responsibility lies solely with the governing body. They're the ones who create these policies in the first place. They actually have gone back and forth historically on whether or not you can have parts of blood or no blood at all. So that means that there are countless people that could have actually survived if they were permitted to have fractions of blood, for instance, plasma or just platelets or just one part of it. The only thing that I think that's good about the blood doctrine is the scientific innovations that have come from it. Because of Jehovah's Witnesses' policy of not taking blood transfusions, for people to be able to have certain medical procedures without the necessity of a blood transfusion, bloodless surgeries. And that could be important for the future, because there are times, like during our recent pandemic that we're still in right now, where blood becomes scarce, where it's more difficult to get a good, consistent supply of blood. So things like bloodless surgeries could actually be useful in that case. I think it's truly horrible that there's a committee assigned in the organization with the sole purpose, the sole goal of pressuring people into denying their family members life-saving medical treatment. That is a despicable, awful, awful thing that shouldn't exist. It's very dangerous. Little babies die from this stuff. It's not just adults like my mother, although my mother had only lived to be 32, so she had quite a bit of her life stolen from her. I'm older now than she was when she passed. So they actually managed to convince my grandmother to steal the life from her own daughter, her favorite daughter. That's what this cult does to people. They use pressure tactics and guilt trips to convince people to do things that they might not otherwise do in their natural state. Not just denying life-saving medical treatment, but also completely cutting off their family members, not having any association with them. This sort of policy really should come to an end. They've already changed it back and forth many times. The reason that they will not permanently end the blood doctrine is because it's so integral to their identity. It does indeed set them apart from other religions. It really does need to be reformed and completely abolished because it's killing people. It is absolutely, it's killing people. It's martyring family members for absolutely no reason. No reason, and I say no reason not just because you should just allow somebody to have medical treatment that they need, but no reason because people have literally died when the policy allowed for them to be able to live at some point. It's ridiculous. The interpretation of the scripture is incorrect too. I really do hope that they change it. I would love to see them change this policy or remove it entirely. I don't see that happening, but I would love to see that happen. I would love to also see the governing body be held accountable for all of the blood that's on their hands.
Ash, this was a terrible time for you, but it did help you reach an important decision about your place within this organization. Isn't that right?
Yes. Actually, I think it comes across a little confusingly in the documentary. When I said that it was the last straw, finding out how far they were willing to go for the religion, I wasn't actually talking about that it made me want to leave. I was actually talking about the fact that it really solidified for me how seriously they took it and that I'd better fall in line. I actually did try to go to meetings and tried to get baptized even after my mother passed away. I went really hard at it. I'm not really sure why they cut that part out of the documentary, actually, because it makes it seem like I left right about then. But I didn't. I tried to become a model witness. But in the end, not even a few months after that, I actually saw some protesters outside of the Kingdom Hall as I was going in with the lady that I study the Bible with. And she was trying to shove me into the Kingdom Hall. She was trying to tell me, don't look at them, don't read that, just go on in, it's okay, don't be afraid of them. I wasn't afraid of them. They weren't doing anything scary. They were just standing across the street on the sidewalk, holding signs. I caught sight of one. It said, "Read the Bible, not the Watchtower." And I thought, well, we do read the Bible. And then that kind of got the wheels turning in my head. And I eventually did think, they are kind of pressuring me to get baptized, and I don't think God would want me to do this under duress. I think God would want me to do this if it's what I truly feel moved to do. Plus, I knew how seriously they took everything. I knew that if I were to mess up in the religion, that I would be shunned, that I would be kicked out, and I would lose my entire support system. I would lose my family, I would lose my friends, and that scared me off, Plus, I didn't really understand everything in the religion. As much as I did my best to, I really didn't understand what I was being taught, because it was usually a lesson that was supplemented with the Watchtower and cherry-picked out of the Bible. You didn't really get to read anything in context. And they have a lot of very confusing doctrine. Just ask anybody about the 607 stuff. That alone is like absolutely, I still can't explain it to people at this point. And I actually know more about the Bible now that I'm out and I use it for activism, than I did back then. So yeah, that was the catalyst, really, was having a seed planted in my head by protesters, and it awakened those doubts in me that this was not the right thing to do. This had to be... it didn't feel right. It just didn't feel right. I was too afraid to stick around and commit myself to something that I did not fully understand. If you're going to dedicate your life to something, you should, 1, fully understand what you're getting into, and 2, really want to do it. And I didn't meet those criteria, so I ended up leaving my house a day before I turned 18, and my grandmother was very, very upset with me. She was actually throwing stuff at me and my friends as we were taking my things out of the house. And the funny thing is, she wasn't even a Jehovah's Witness. None of the family members that I lived with were practicing Jehovah's Witnesses at the time. My grandmother had been disfellowshipped for almost 2 decades at that point. But she was angry at me for leaving the religion. When I got to my new house, by the way, the very next day, Jehovah's Witnesses showed up at the door. And it was the 2 people that I had studied the Bible with. They were looking for me. My friend's mother actually answered the door. I didn't answer. I was hiding behind the couch. And she told them that I wasn't there, and I could hear the witnesses say at the door, "Well, tell her that her grandmother misses her very much, and that we miss her too, and we're very worried about her, and we just hope she comes back to the meetings." And I knew 100% I was not going to go back to the meetings at that point. I was like, nope, not doing it. I can't do it. And I didn't return again until I was 26, but that's a whole other story. I only went back just to try to get baptized so I could be close to my family again, because it was miserable between 18 and 26 not being able to be around my family. My grandmother did get reinstated when I was 21. She was moved by my cousin's baptism and felt like she could return at that point. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I just wanted to clear that up about the last straw thing, because they didn't really give the full context of what I was saying there, so it kind of sounds like I just left right away after the blood doctrine. But right. That was a factor, though. I mean, it did scare me, the idea of, well, what if I end up needing blood? What if I have to make that choice for another family member? What if I get married and have children and they expect me to do that to my children? I can't do that. I even knew then that I wasn't going to be able to do that, which is another reason I said, I could get disfellowshipped if I get baptized and I don't do what they tell me to. So I have to leave. I have to make a choice here. Plus, I wanted to go to college, and I was, slated to go to college right after I graduated high school. And, that's part of why they were pressuring me so much to get baptized. They wanted to prevent me from going to college. They kept trying to pressure me to instead spend my time in a menial job, like just some, something that could get me by, basically, and spend the rest of my hours preaching for the organization.
Well, you are out of the religion now and are an activist speaking out on your own YouTube channel, as well as attending protests. You are now out and proud as a man. So what would you say to anyone watching this interview who may be going through a similar situation to you, perhaps as a person in the LGBT community within the JWs, or maybe going through a difficult time with the blood doctrine? What advice would you give to them right now?
My advice to anybody in the organization who wants to leave or is having doubts would be, of course, to do research if you're not sure. But if you already are dead set on leaving, do so when it's safe to do so for you. And that goes for people who are part of the LGBT community as well. Don't come out until it is safe for you to do so. Don't put yourself in danger if you don't have to. I advise reaching out to your friends, to your community, to your local resources. Whatever you have to do, just make a plan and then try to carry that out to allow yourself to leave safely. Don't do what I did and just rush out the door. It's not always going to work out very well.
Care about you.
Yes, it was your mother's
Also,
choice. We're all calling
please
the police.
look into the child sex abuse cases in Australia. Sir, you cannot touch me. That's in your elder's letter. Look into the child sex abuse cases in the Australia Royal Commission. Please look up the Australian Royal Commission. Sir, you cannot touch me. That is against the law, sir.
There were some things that didn't quite come through in the documentary, such as they cut out part of what I was saying at my protest in the Kingdom Hall right before I was about to start speaking about the child abuse. I always talk about the child abuse every protest I do. I always mention the big three things: the shunning, the blood doctrine, and the child abuse. As for my protests, people seem to have the idea that I do this out of anger at the organization, or just to get back at them, or to work through trauma. I don't. I don't do it for myself. I did one protest that was for me, and that was my very first protest at my old Kingdom Hall. And I'm not under any illusion that the Kingdom Hall protests work for every single person, or that they're instantly effective. They plant a seed, like I said in the documentary. I also don't like to call them crashes anymore, because I think that that has a negative connotation, and it implies that it's going to be some kind of a violent, angry sort of event, and it's not. I always go in there with love and concern. I also do other kinds of activism and protests. I protest outside of Kingdom Halls. I speak to witnesses on the streets who are out in field service, at their carts, going door to door. And more recently, I've actually been studying with Jehovah's Witnesses and just asking them questions to try to get their minds, focused on trying to answer the question, and then realizing that they may not actually have the answer to the question I'm asking. And it kind of plants a seed in that way too. And it's been pretty effective. I also wanted to let people know, because there's been speculation about whether or not what I've done in the past, the Kingdom Hall protests where I go inside, whether or not they actually work. They do. They actually do work. I've had many people contact me over the years to let me know that they were present at one of my protests. And most recently, there was actually somebody who contacted me, and he was a ministerial servant, and he said that he listened to all the things that I had said, that he couldn't believe that those things would all be true. He said they couldn't possibly be true. So he went and researched them himself, and when he found out that they were true, he left. And that usually tends to be the case. People do tend to hear what I say, try to prove it wrong, and then end up leaving. So it does work. But like I said, I'm not under any illusion that it works on everybody, or that it's going to be immediately effective like that. Usually it takes some time for them to finally go and look these things up. People have also said that I'm traumatizing people by going in there. And to that I say, I am not traumatizing people. I mean, I don't think I'm traumatizing. I'm not trying to. I don't go in there and, wave a weapon at anybody or try to hurt anybody. I only raise my voice so I can be heard, and I actually am quite soft-spoken in real life. But yeah, I certainly don't traumatize people any more than Watchtower does. They're the ones who are doing the real damage. I just go in there with information, and people can do with that what they will. I don't try to convert anybody or tell them what to believe.
I will leave a link to the Vice documentary as well as your social media in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you very much indeed, Asher, for coming on to Talk Beliefs.
I really appreciated this chat. Thank you so much.